Welcome to the deep dive. So we got this really interesting question, one I know I've wondered about too. Why is Python's online community on Reddit just so much bigger? Like, our Python has, what, over 500,000 members?
Yeah, way over 500K. And then you look at Ruby, and it's sitting around 65,000. It's a huge difference.
It really is. So
Yeah,
we wanted to figure out why.
exactly. So we dug into a bunch of stuff. There's the original Reddit discussion in Ruby itself, naturally. Then an article comparing Ruby on Rails and Django for this year.
Okay, the big web frameworks.
Right. Plus some performance benchmarks from the benchmarks game, a blog post with like 10 questions to ask when choosing between Ruby and Python,
Useful.
a big guide on Python, another piece focusing just on web development differences, and even a guide for Python folks looking at Ruby, so quite a bit to go through.
Definitely sounds like it. So the mission today is basically to unpack why that community size gap exists.
Yeah.
Right. And more importantly for everyone listening, pull out some useful stuff about what each language is good at, maybe not so good at.
Yeah, what it all means if you're, trying to decide or just curious about these languages.
Okay, perfect. So let's start right there in the Ruby thread. What were people in the Ruby community saying about why their subreddit's smaller?
Well, a few main ideas popped up again and again. One big one was Python being taught as like the standard dynamic language in a lot of engineering schools now.
Ah, okay. So early
Yeah.
exposure basically builds a bigger base.
Seems logical, yeah. If it's the first language you really learn, you're probably going to stick with it, or at least look for info online about it.
Makes sense.
What else?
Another huge one, and this came up a lot, is the whole machine learning and data science explosion. Python just completely dominates that space.
Right, you can't avoid it if you're looking into AI or data stuff.
Exactly. And that's pulled in just a massive number of new users, people who might not have even been traditional programmers before.
Yeah.
So, a key thing here is Python getting dug into these huge growing fields. It's not just having the tools, it's being the choice.
Right.
That creates momentum.
Absolutely, that network effect. Right. And related to that, several people mentioned Python syntax. It's generally seen as simpler, more straightforward.
More readable, almost like English. I've heard that.
Yeah, that's the common take. And that makes it easier for people maybe without a formal CS background to jump in. Lowers the barrier to entry.
Okay, so broader appeal from that angle too.
Definitely. Now, flipping that, the feeling in the Ruby thread was that their community is really heavily focused on web development, mostly through Ruby on Rails.
The framework.
Yeah. They admitted there are smaller, passionate groups doing other things, like games maybe, but the big concentration, web apps.
So maybe Ruby's strength in web, while huge, also means it's targeting a slightly narrower slice of the overall programming pie on a general site like Reddit.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. And people also brought up Python just being used for everything, like its general purpose nature.
Like what sort of things?
Oh, security scripting, little games, automation tasks, just a really wide range. So that naturally pulls in people with all sorts of different interests.
More ways for people to find common ground, I guess.
Exactly. Though it wasn't all just Python's bigger is better. One person made the point that, the Python subreddit sometimes feels like it's full of really basic beginner questions.
Ah, so size isn't everything? Maybe the type of discussion is different.
Could be. Yeah, that's a valid counterpoint. A huge group might have lots of intro stuff, while a smaller one could be deeper, but just in its niche.
Interesting.
And on that note, some Ruby folks suggested Twitter might actually be where more of their community hangs out. They even listed some key Ruby and Rails people to follow there.
Oh, that's handy. So the community exists, maybe just not all consolidated on Reddit.
Right. Shows you gotta look around sometimes. Another interesting point was Python's strength in areas like finance, crypto trading, even gambling, apparently.
Really? Why's that?
Libraries like NumPy for handling lots of numbers efficiently. So that pulls in a whole different crowd, quants, traders, people with very specific needs.
Okay, so Python's toolbox is attracting specialists from finance too. Adds to the diversity.
Definitely. And then there was this more subjective feeling someone shared. They felt the Python community was maybe friendlier, more helpful, especially if you're coding on Windows.
Windows, is that less common for Ruby?
Can be, yeah. So that user felt they got better support for Windows setups in the Python world. Community vibe is important, right?
Hugely important, yeah.
And then, well, the obvious one, Python's just more popular overall. So more users means bigger communities. It's kind of a feedback loop.
The bigger get bigger sort of thing.
Pretty much. Someone even joked that maybe because Reddit itself is written in Python, that gives our Python a bit of a home field advantage.
Huh. That's a fun theory. Probably not the main reason, but
You never know. And then one comment I thought was really insightful. Maybe Ruby's strengths, like its focus on developer happiness and elegant design, are more subtle.
subtle. How so?
Like maybe they're things you appreciate more once you're deep into coding.
Yeah.
Whereas Python has these really immediate, obvious benefits. Easy to learn, great for science stuff.
So Ruby prioritizes the experience of coding, maybe, even if it's not as immediately grabbing as Python's wide reach.
That's kind of the implication, yeah. A different philosophy almost.
Interesting.
And finally, someone just put it very simply. Marketing.
Chuckles. Just marketing.
Well, in the broad sense, visibility, how well
Yeah.
it's promoted, documentation quality, all that stuff plays a role in how popular any tech gets.
Okay, wow. So a whole mix of reasons: education, industry trends, syntax, community factors, even maybe a bit of marketing.
Seems like it, yeah?
Right, let's pivot then.
Yeah.
You mentioned web development being Ruby's traditional stronghold. Let's talk Rails versus Django. What did the sources say there?
Okay, yeah. So Ruby is almost synonymous with Ruby on Rails for a lot of people, and our sources definitely back that up. Rails really did shake things up with its convention over configuration idea.
What does that mean exactly?
It basically means Rails makes a lot of sensible default decisions for you, so you don't spend ages setting things up. You follow the conventions and just start building your app faster. Really sped up development.
Yeah, I remember that buzz around Rails. It felt like the fastest way to build a web app for a while.
It really was influential. And now Python's big player in that space is Django. It also uses a pattern to structure things. Rails uses MVC, Model View Controller. Django uses MVT, Model View Template. Slightly different terminology, similar goal, organizing your code.
And both are used for big sites, right?
Oh, yeah. The article we looked at mentioned Django powers Instagram, YouTube, Spotify's huge scale.
Wow.
And Rails is behind Airbnb, Bloomberg, Shopify. So clearly, both frameworks can handle really demanding applications. No question there.
So if they're both capable of that scale, what are the differences in how they approach web development? Where do they shine?
Well, the consensus seems to be that Rails is particularly strong for rapid prototyping, getting something up and running fast, and also for projects where you expect things to change a lot.
Why is that?
Its modular design, using all those plugins called gems, lets experienced devs build stuff very quickly. Sources also mentioned it's generally easier to migrate or modify things in Rails later on, more flexible, perhaps.
Okay, so Rails for speed and flexibility. What about Django's strengths?
Django often gets the nod if you know you need to deeply integrate machine learning or AI stuff into your web app, which makes sense given Python's dominance there.
Right, leveraging the wider Python ecosystem.
Exactly. Django's also seen as maybe more batteries included out of the box, a bit more structured. And one specific advantage often mentioned is its built-in REST framework, which makes creating APIs supposedly easier than it can be with Rails sometimes.
Interesting trade-offs. Speed and iteration with Rails versus maybe structure and AI integration with Django.
That's a decent summary, yeah.
What about libraries? You mentioned gems for Rails. Python has its own system, right?
Oh, yeah. Both have huge ecosystems. Ruby Gems has over 150,000 gems available, but Python's package index, PyPI, is even bigger, over 300,000 packages.
Wow, okay. So no shortage of add-ons for either one.
Definitely not. You can extend them in countless ways.
And actual websites out there. Is one framework used more than the other?
The data was a bit mixed, actually. One source said, overall, more total sites use Rails currently. But in a specific recent month, more new sites were actually launched with Rails.
Oh, interesting. So Rails is still actively chosen for new projects.
Seems so. But that same data showed Rails sites also had a higher drop-off rate, like sites being taken down. And then you look at developer surveys, like from Stack Overflow, and more devs generally say they prefer Django.
Huh. So Rails might have more sites total, but Django might be preferred by more developers. It's complex.
It is. Rails is definitely still popular, especially for certain kinds of projects, but Django has huge momentum too. They're both major players, maybe just appealing slightly differently.
Okay, so web dev is clearly important for both, but it sounds like we need to talk about what Python does beyond web. That seemed key to the community size difference.
Absolutely. This is where Python's reach really becomes apparent. We touched on data science, machine learning, AI. Python's dominance there is just massive.
Because of the libraries.
Yeah, NumPy, Pandas for data manipulation, TensorFlow, Keras, scikit-learn for machine learning. The list goes on. The sources all agree Ruby just doesn't have the same depth of tools in those specific, very hot areas.
That data science wave really seems like the tide that lifted Python's boat incredibly high.
No question. But it's not just that. Python's used much more widely in other areas, too.
Like what?
Game development, scripting and automation, writing little helper programs, desktop apps using things like PyQt, cybersecurity, finance, like we mentioned.
It really is a Swiss Army knife kind of language, isn't it?
Seems that way. That huge versatility just draws in a really diverse crowd. People trying to solve all sorts of different problems find that Python often has a tool or a library ready to go.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense in explaining the sheer number of users. Now let's loop back to syntax and learning curve. We heard on Reddit that Python was easier. Did the other sources confirm that?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Python syntax gets clear, readable, beginner-friendly across the board. That enforced indentation, while some grumble about it, does make code look pretty consistent.
Easier to read someone else's code, maybe.
That's the idea, yeah. Promotes a standard style.
And how is Ruby's syntax described in contrast?
Often praised as elegant, expressive. The goal is to feel natural, almost like writing sentences, which experienced devs often love. But that flexibility can mean more ways to write the same thing, maybe less consistency between different code bases. And Ruby has concepts like blocks and symbols that might feel a bit foreign if you're totally new to programming.
So elegant, but maybe a slightly steeper initial climb than Python's straightforwardness.
That's the general picture painted by the sources, yeah.
Sure.
One blog explicitly said for brand new programmers, Python's clarity gives it the edge.
Okay, learnability is one thing. What about speed? Performance? Does one language just run faster than the other? Is that why Python's more popular?
Probably not the main reason. The benchmarks game shows some differences, sure, but it's often really specific tasks and can be complex to interpret.
Right.
And as one source rightly pointed out, for most real-world applications, especially big web apps, the raw language speed isn't usually the bottleneck. Your overall architecture, database choices, things like that matter way more.
Makes sense. A fast engine and a badly designed car won't win the race.
Exactly. That said, there were mentions. Ruby sometimes gets criticized for being slower on CPU-heavy tasks. Python, on the other hand, can get speed boosts from C extensions, like NumPy, or alternative interpreters like PyPy.
So Python might have more options to speed things up if needed.
Potentially. Though interestingly, one data point showed Rails being technically like 0.7% faster than Django in one test, but that's tiny.
Yeah, hardly a deciding factor. So performance seems pretty nuanced and likely not the reason for the community size gap.
Agreed. Now, circling back to community, again, that perception of friendliness, especially for Windows users, that came up on Reddit. Did other sources touch on that vibe?
Was I mentioned elsewhere?
Well, the big Python guide we looked at described its community as one of the largest, most active globally, and specifically called it inclusive and supportive. Great for learning.
And Rui's.
Described as passionate, strong, definitely dedicated, especially around Rails, but maybe more niche or specialized.
So the perception aligns a bit. Python's bigger pool might just mean more readily available help, especially for common or maybe slightly unusual setups.
That seems like a fair takeaway. If you hit a weird edge case, the odds of finding someone else who's seen it might just be higher in the larger Python community,
Yeah.
especially perhaps on broader platforms like Stack Overflow.
Right. Okay, last big area, the future. Are these languages still evolving? What's the outlook?
Good question. Both have been around a while. One blog suggested Ruby's move fast and break things approach, especially with Rails, can lead to quicker innovation in web dev trends.
Rails has often pushed web development forward, that's true.
Yeah, it's often been on the cutting edge there. Python's evolution is often described as maybe more gradual, but incredibly stable. When big new things arrive, like TensorFlow, they tend to be very robust and get wide adoption.
Different styles of innovation, maybe?
Perhaps, but the overall outlook from the sources seemed positive for both. Python's uses keep expanding, and Ruby, particularly Rails, is still seen as a really strong choice for building web apps efficiently.
Good to know they both still have legs. Now, before we wrap, were there key similarities mentioned, things they both do well?
Yeah, definitely. Important not to forget those. Both are open source, both are dynamically typed, both support functional programming ideas pretty well.
Okay.
Both have active communities, obviously, even of different sizes. Both have tons of libraries. Both have good ways to manage different versions of the language and project dependencies.
And both are free to use, right?
Yep, general purpose and free. So fundamentally, they share a lot of core strengths as powerful developer tools.
Okay, so let's try and boil it down. Bringing everything together, what are the top reasons Python's community, especially on Reddit, seems so much larger?
Well, it really looks like a perfect storm, kind of. First, Python's incredibly broad application range hitting those huge growth areas like data science and AI is a massive factor.
Right, capturing those massive trends.
Second, its syntax. That perceived simplicity and readability just opens the door to a wider audience, including beginners and people from non-CS backgrounds.
Lower barrier to entry.
Exactly. And third, just the momentum of popularity. More users leads to more resources, more visibility, which attracts more users that cycle.
But, and this is important, we need to stress that community size isn't the only measure, right?
Absolutely not. It doesn't automatically mean better or the right choice for you. Ruby clearly has a smaller but very strong, passionate, and focused community, especially doing great work in web development with Rails.
It offers different strengths that rapid development, the focus on the developer experience.
Precisely. Python offers incredible versatility. Ruby and Rails offer focused power and agility, particularly for the web. They solve different problems well, or sometimes the same problems in different ways.
Which leads perfectly into a final thought for our listeners.
Yeah, when you're thinking about a language, don't just look at the popularity charts or subreddit sizes. Think about your interests. What kind of projects excite you? What kind of coding style feels good to you?
Align the tool with your own goals and preferences.
Exactly. And maybe the best way to figure that out isn't just reading about it, but actually trying it. Build a small project in Python. Build a small project in Ruby. See how each one feels firsthand. That personal experience might tell you more than anything else.
That's fantastic advice. Get your hands dirty. Thanks for diving deep into this with us today.